This is Chapter 12, Social Psychology. In this first section, we'll explore what social psychology is. Social psychology is defined as the field of psychology that examines how people impact or affect each other, with particular focus on the power of the situation. It includes interpersonal topics, and these are those that pertain to the individual, including emotions and attitudes, the self, and social cognition. And it also includes interpersonal topics, and these are those that pertain to dyads and groups. So this includes helping behavior, aggression, prejudice and discrimination, attraction and close relationships, and group processes and intergroup relations. So we start by looking at situational and dispositional influences on behavior, and these are important in the study of social psychology because we are essentially studying group dynamics, and group dynamics are often very much affected by the situation. So situationism describes a perspective that behavior and actions are determined by the immediate environment and surroundings. It's a view that's promoted by social psychologists. Dispositionism describes a perspective common to personality psychologists and the public in general, which asserts that our behavior is determined by internal factors such as personality traits and temperament. An internal factor is an internal attribute of a person, such as personality traits again or temperament. What we've found is that overwhelmingly, we tend to make what is referred to as the fundamental attribution error. And this is a tendency to overemphasize internal factors as attributions for behavior and underestimate the power of the situation. So they have several studies that they've done to demonstrate this. This is one example. The idea here is that when we view someone's behavior, we tend to believe that it is a reflection of who they are inherently versus a reaction to their environment. The reality is that much of our behavior, most of our behavior, is reactive. So is the fundamental attribution error a universal phenomenon? Remember that we've explored differences in individualistic and collectivist cultures before. As a reminder, an individualistic culture is one that focuses on individual achievement and autonomy, and a collectivist culture is one that focuses on communal relationships with others, such as family, friends, and community. What they found is that in collectivist cultures, they are much less likely to make the fundamental attribution error, meaning that when they see someone's behavior, they are less likely to attribute it to that individual's inherent personality or way of being, and more likely to attribute it to the situation. So as always, culture influences mindset, and that includes how we see each other. Actor-observer bias is a phenomenon of explaining other people's behaviors as being due to internal factors, but our own behaviors due to situational forces. So this is a very self-convenient way of behaving. What this means is that when we see someone else's behavior, especially if it's something negative, we are likely to attribute that behavior as being due to the way that they are. Again, that's the fundamental attribution error. When we engage in a similar behavior, however, we are likely to blame the situation or the circumstances and not our inherent way of being. So when we engage in the behavior, we have excuses. When others behave in the behavior, we have accusations. This refers to a self-serving bias. This is a tendency for individuals to take credit by making dispositional or internal attributions for positive outcomes and situational or external attributions for negative outcomes. So if I do well, it's because I did a great job. If I do poorly, it was because of these circumstances or situations, okay? That is a self-serving bias. All of this is just referring to the way that we attribute someone's or what we attribute someone's behavior to. Attribution is just an explanation for the behavior of other people. We make attributions all the time. So another way we could say it is their judgments, their assumptions. Okay? One such attribution that we have studied for a while is the just world hypothesis. And this is an ideology common in the United States that people get the outcomes that they deserve. So for example, ideas such as good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. These sound really nice, and they're things that you probably have been taught since you were very little, but they are not actually rooted in reality. It's a very dichotomous and black and white view of the world that is not reflective of the reality of the world, which is largely gray. So the negative consequences of the just world hypothesis are believing that people deserve what they get, is that you may blame people who are disadvantaged for their situation. Ideas like the poor are lazy and just don't want to work, or poor people want to live off the government. These are the types of ideas that are reflective of just world hypothesis. In addition, victim blaming in general. For example, if you think about comments that you may have heard or maybe even made yourself about victims of violence that we've seen heavily in the news over the last several years, or even victims of sexual assault. Often there is language around discussions of these issues that suggests that the person who is on the receiving end of violence is somehow responsible for that. The theory behind this is that it's believed that we don't have a lot of tolerance for the idea that the world may not be just. Anyone who lives in the world with practical eyes can see that the world is not just. There is absolutely unfairness everywhere. But it's not a comfortable idea. What's much more comfortable is to believe that the world is just, that if you do good things will happen to you. If you don't do bad things won't happen to you. It's a very kind of fairy tale way of thinking, but many adults live with it because it makes them more comfortable. So when something happens to disturb this idea that the world is just, it's much easier to say that the thing that happened was the fault of the victim than to acknowledge that the world is an uncomfortable place sometimes. We'll look now at self-presentation. We've talked about this a bit before, but a social role is a socially defined pattern of behavior that is expected of a person in a given setting or a group. And it is largely dictated by social norms, which are the group's expectations regarding what is appropriate and acceptable for the thoughts and behavior of its members. This includes a script or a person's knowledge about the sequence of events in a specific setting. One of the most famous experiments within social psychology, and there are many, is Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. You can do extra research on this if you'd like to. It's a very interesting experiment, also very controversial. In the Stanford Prison Experiment, Stanford University conducted an experiment in a mock prison that demonstrated the power of social roles, social norms, and scripts. Students were divided into categories of either prison staff or prisoner. And what they found is that in a very short time, whatever role the students were assigned, they tended to take on very seriously and changing their behavior from the way that they normally were, becoming more passive if they were prisoners overwhelmingly, and becoming more aggressive if they were prison staff overwhelmingly. And so this is just one of many other studies that have explored how roles, in particular our ideas about those roles, influence our thinking and thus our behavior. We'll look now at attitudes and persuasion. A very popular concept in social psychology is the idea of cognitive dissonance. So we'll start by looking at what an attitude is. An attitude is just an evaluation of or feelings toward a person, an idea, or an object that are typically positive or negative. So you have attitudes about everything, yourself and everything else you experience in the world. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological discomfort that arises from a conflict in a person's behavior, attitudes, or beliefs that runs counter to one's positive self-perception. So essentially what cognitive dissonance means is that you have an attitude, an idea about something, and it doesn't match your behavior about that thing. Once you become aware that your behavior does not match with your attitude, that makes you uncomfortable because it disturbs your self-concept, the way that you like to see yourself. And so the ideal thing to do would be to adjust your behavior so that it matches your attitude. But overwhelmingly what we find is that when people experience this cognitive dissonance, what they instead do is adjust their attitude to match their behavior. So for example, let's say that you don't believe in making inappropriate comments about people in ethnic groups or gender groups that are different from yours. But then you find yourself laughing at a bad joke that a friend makes that does just that. You have the option to do the much harder thing of saying that, you know, I don't know why I laughed at that. I don't really think that's funny or appropriate. People are much less likely to do that. They're uncomfortable doing it. There's a lot of pressure, social pressure involved around doing such a thing that would be brave like that. Instead, what people usually do is say, well, there's some truth to the joke, or it's not that big a deal, it's just a joke. So you essentially excuse your behavior instead of correcting your behavior. What happens in that is that unfortunately it also shifts your attitude, and so your thinking changes as well, okay? So what becomes really important, I think, in the whole of this chapter is to pay close attention to what it is that you want to see yourself as, and what you do to try to maintain that image for yourself and for other people. The more that you are trying to maintain an idea of who you are, the more trouble you are likely to get yourself and others into. So we'll look now at the effect of initiation. Very interesting research here as well. Initiation just refers to a difficult incoming into a group. When we have a difficult initiation or a hard time getting into a group, what we find is that it actually influences us to like the group more. The belief here is that there is an effort to justify your efforts, your hard work to get into the group. So the example they give us here is 20-year-old John, who joins the military. He hates basic training. It's very difficult, but instead of saying that he didn't like the experience or doesn't like the military, he changes his attitude about it. And so he instead becomes more loving of what he is now a part of because he had to work so hard to be a part of it. Persuasion is a process of changing our attitude towards something based on some form of communication. And they found that there are a couple of different ways that this persuasion can occur. The Yale attitude change approach describes the conditions under which people tend to change their attitude. That includes credibility of the speaker. So what's important here is to acknowledge that this won't necessarily be across the board, that someone is credible to everyone. We all have our own ideas of what authority or credibility look like. So that's important for you to take some time to think about, because whatever your vision of credibility or authority is, those will be the people who are more likely to persuade you. The subtlety of the message, the quality of being important but not obvious, the sidedness of the message, having more than one side, the timing, and again, the credibility of the message itself. All of these things will also influence persuasion. And then attention, intelligence, self-esteem, and the age of the person receiving the message all influence how easily they are persuaded. When we are talking about persuasion, there are two different routes that are often used. The first is a logic-driven argument route. This is using data, facts, to convince people of an argument's worthiness. The central route to persuasion essentially asks you to be thoughtful and intelligent about being persuaded. It asks you to look at information, to analyze it, and to make a decision in that way. The peripheral route to persuasion, on the other hand, is when a person persuades another one in an indirect way that relies on an association of peripheral cues, such as positive emotions and celebrity endorsement, to associate positivity with the message. So the peripheral route to persuasion is essentially an emotional appeal versus a intellectual appeal. And you can guess which one is usually much more effective. That is the peripheral route. People tend to respond much more through their emotions than their intellect. There's nothing wrong with your emotions, of course, but ideally we make our decisions using both of the things that we've been armed with. So the elaboration likelihood model features the source of the persuasive message, contents of the message, and characteristics of the audience that are used to determine when attitude change will occur. For the central route, if the audience is motivated and analytical, and they have the ability to engage in the high effort to evaluate the message, then they will have a lasting change in attitude. Okay, and again, that central route is the persuasion through intellect. The peripheral route, if the audience is not very motivated and not very analytical, then they don't have to engage in very high effort, so they can be persuaded by cues outside of the message, such as music or imagery, or what sometimes is referred to as dog whistles, or these are phrases or things that appeal again to kind of emotional experiences. It creates usually a temporary change in attitude, but unfortunately a more intense one often. One of the other aspects of persuasion that has been studied is the foot in the door technique. And this is the persuasion of one person by another person, encouraging that person to agree to a small favor first, or to buy a small item, only to later request a larger favor or purchase of a larger item. So the idea with the foot in the door technique is that agreement to a smaller request will eventually lead to agreement to a larger request. If I can get you to say yes to $10, I can probably get you to say yes to $100. So with the foot in the door technique, a small request such as wearing a campaign button can turn into a large request, such as putting campaign signs in your yard. We'll look now at conformity, compliance, and obedience. These are key areas that have been studied in social psychology for some time. Conformity refers to when individuals change their behavior to go along with the group, even if they do not agree with the group. A confederate is a person who works for a researcher and is aware of the experiment, but who acts as a participant. They are used to manipulate social situations as part of the research design. So Osh's conformity study is one of the most popular. And what he did is a very simple but brilliant experiment where he put people in situations where they thought that they were in a group of other research participants. In fact, the others were confederates. And they were asked to determine whether or not line X is similar in length to line A, line B, or line C. During the first couple of rounds of these questions, everybody was in agreement. And then afterwards, the Confederates were instructed to give an inaccurate answer, a very clearly inaccurate answer. And the research determined where conformity, how strong conformity was by whether or not the actual research participant gave the correct answer or went along with the group and gave the incorrect answer. So the way that might look is that they go down the line and the Confederates all agree that B is the same length as X. As you can see, B is dramatically shorter than X. The research then would measure the level of conformity of the research participant by whether or not they agreed that B was the same length as X, or whether or not they disagreed. So the Osh effect is that the group majority influences an individual's judgment, even when that judgment is inaccurate. And we've seen this done over and over again in research. Typically, it's around 60% of people that will go along with this kind of conformist-based behavior. So when we are in group situations, and the size of the group does count, we are much less likely to do what we believe is correct and much more likely to go along with the group, which is, of course, extremely scary and dangerous. So the greater the number of people in the majority, the more likely an individual is going to conform. The smaller the number, and usually less than three or less, the more likely the person is to maintain their individuality in thought and action. The presence of another dissenter is extremely powerful. So this is important for you to understand as you are learning this and to use in your future. When you are in a group and people are conforming, we can't read each other's minds. And so what we tend to do is assume that everyone is on the same page because of silence. And silence is the death of all justice. So when you're in a situation where you think something is happening that is wrong or inappropriate, is going to be harmful to you or to someone else, it's now your obligation to speak up and say something, because what we found is that when people do speak up, it just takes one person. Then others who also disagree with what's happening will also feel comfortable speaking up. But it takes that first person to be brave enough to lead the charge. So if there's at least one dissenter, conformity rates drop to nearly zero. It's as though we just need a little bit of validation or confirmation that what we are thinking is correct. And so someone has to, again, lead the charge to say, so, hey, this isn't right, this isn't appropriate, this is not okay. And then other people feel comfortable voicing that as well. What you'll find usually then when that happens is that whatever is happening that's inappropriate or wrong, the people who agree with it tend to be actually in a really, really small group. They're not the majority. They only appear to be so because those who disagree keep quiet. The public or private nature of the responses is also very influential. So when responses are made publicly, meaning there's that peer pressure, conformity is much more likely. However, when responses are made privately, for example, writing down the response, then conformity is much less likely. So this really, again, is perhaps surprising to you, perhaps not, but what it's really saying is that when we are in groups, we are extremely influenced by the group. And that can be lovely if the group is coming together to do something pro-social. It can be horrible and have devastating consequences if the group is coming together to do otherwise. And so it is our responsibility, understanding this information, again, to speak up. So we'll look now at normative versus informational influence or conformity. What they've found is that the reasons for people's conformity are different. And so when people are influenced, which is largely what's happening through normative social influence, they are conforming to a group or norm to fit in, to feel good, and to be accepted by the group. Everyone likes to view themselves as being very individualistic, and having great strength of individuality and willpower, but the reality is that most people want to feel like they're with everybody else. Informational social influence is a little different. This is when we conform to a group norm because we believe that the group is competent, more so than us, and that they have the correct information. So this is essentially, feeling that you are ignorant or maybe having actual ignorance. If you think about if you're in a group situation and perhaps you haven't done the reading for whatever the group assignment is, you are likely to conform, meaning go along with the group, because you don't feel like you have the knowledge to be able to contribute or to provide any type of opposition to the ideas being presented. And so in that case, you would be operating under informational social influence because you don't feel like you have the information, so you follow along with those who appear to have it. We also look at obedience, and Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment is another of the very popular ones within social psychology. So obedience is a change of behavior to please an authority figure or to avoid aversive consequences. And remember what I said earlier, it's really important to understand what you consider to be authority, because these are going to be the situations or the people that will have greater influence over your thoughts and behaviors. So groupthink refers to when members modify their opinions to match what they believe is the group consensus. So the joke here is that when people get together to think about things as a group, of course the purpose of getting together with the group is so that you can have diversity of thought and ideas to come up with a good response or solution or plan. But when people get together, they tend not to actually engage in this diversity of thought and instead just go along with the flow. There are several symptoms of groupthink, including perceiving the group as invulnerable or invincible, believing it can do no wrong. So this is often what happens when people engage in groups that have extreme ideas. The longer they spend time in that group, the more that they believe that that group is correct and all-knowing. Believing the group is morally correct. This is the most dangerous thing ever. So when people believe that they individually or collectively have the moral high ground, they actually become quite dangerous because there's no room for any other type of thought, and they can act on their thoughts in very dramatic and devastating ways. Self-censorship by the group members, such as withholding information to avoid disrupting the group consensus. The quashing of dissenting group members' opinions. So this is, kind of essentially applying pressure to people in the group that appear not to agree. The shielding of the group leader from dissenting views, perceiving an illusion of unanimity among group members, and then holding stereotypes or negative attitudes towards the out group or others with differing viewpoints. These things likely sound very familiar to you. We all have ideas and opinions, and when we align with people who share those ideas and opinions, what we find is that those ideas and opinions actually become more extreme, which is why it is extremely important to remain in groups of diversity in thought and otherwise. What we're referring to here is group polarization, and this is the strengthening of the original group attitude after discussing views within the group. Again, discussing your ideas with people who share them intensifies your ideas and makes you more oppositional to ideas that are different from yours. We're looking at social facilitation and social loafing. Social facilitation is improved performance when an audience is watching versus when the individual performs the behavior alone. What's key to social facilitation, though, is competence. When people have experience in whatever it is that they're doing, then their performance improves and is enhanced by the presence of an audience. When, however, they are novices and they do not have experience with what they're doing, their performance actually is worse. Social loafing is exertion of less effort by a person working in a group because of individual performance, not being evaluated separately from the group. So this causes performance to decline on easy tasks. Usually social loafing is not actually the result of people just being lazy and letting other people carry the load, but it's more a function of normative conformist behavior. So remember earlier there was that informational influence. And so again, when people are in groups, if they feel that they are not capable or competent, they tend to make less effort because they feel like the other people in the group can handle things better. We'll look now at prejudice and discrimination. This is in your text. It's just a kind of quick chart to give you clarification on these three terms that tend to be used interchangeably socially, but they have actually each distinct definitions. So you can leave at least an understanding what the difference between these three are. Stereotype is a cognitive function. They're thoughts about people. The connection to the larger exploration that we're having in this chapter is that they are overgeneralized beliefs about people that can lead to prejudice. So a stereotype is a thought, okay? The example that they give, and these examples are quite benign considering the serious issues that these are associated with, but the example they give are Yankee fans are arrogant and obnoxious. That's a thought, okay? That's a stereotype. Prejudice, on the other hand, is affective. That means it's a feeling about people. A prejudice can be positive or negative. The feelings may then influence the treatment of others. They often do, leading to discrimination. The example they give us is that thought, the stereotype, Yankee fans are arrogant and obnoxious, now leads to a feeling. I hate Yankee fans, they make me angry. And finally, discrimination is a behavior. It's an action. It can be positive or negative treatment of others. The connection here is that holding a stereotype and harboring a prejudice may lead to excluding, avoiding, and biased treatment of group members. So in our example where we had initially a thought, a stereotype that Yankees fans are arrogant and obnoxious, that then led to a feeling that I hate Yankee fans, they make me angry, it now leads to an action. I would never hire nor become friends with a person if I knew he or she were a Yankees fan. Again, these are quite silly examples. We know that this has much greater consequences than sports when we are dealing with different ethnicities, or race as we refer to it in this country, or gender. So again, to clarify, the stereotype is the thought, the prejudice is the feeling, the discrimination is the action. Racism is prejudice and discrimination toward individuals based solely on their race. Sexism is prejudice and discrimination toward individuals based on their sex. Ageism is prejudice and discrimination toward individuals based solely on their age. And homophobia is prejudice and discrimination against individuals based solely on their sexual orientation. So these are 4 different types of prejudice and discrimination, and we can identify and categorize several more, but these are the most common that we see as problematic in our culture. So why do prejudice and discrimination exist? There are a couple of ideas. One is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is treating stereotyped group members according to our biased expectations, only to have this treatment influence the individual to act according to our stereotypic expectations, thus confirming our stereotypic beliefs. So for example, if you believe that a group of people is violent and you treat them in ways that are unfair or in fact violent, because violence is not limited to physical action, then you are likely to get reactions that are not positive, that are hostile, and this would then just reinforce your ideas when the reality is that your own actions and behavior prompted the reaction from them. Confirmation bias is when we seek out information that supports our stereotypes and ignore information that is inconsistent with our stereotypes. And this concept has been introduced before in the course. It's extremely important to understand how these function. Essentially what we do is have blinders to information that doesn't fit with what we already think. And then we key in or home in on information that appears to match what we do think. And then that means, of course, that we can perceive whatever we want to. And perception, as we've already discussed, is a very tricky and tenuous thing. What becomes extremely important in the operation of prejudice and discrimination as well is the concept of in-group and out-group. An in-group is a group that we identify with or see ourselves as belonging to. It results in in-group bias, a preference for our own group over other groups. Out-groups are groups that we don't belong to, and ones that we view as fundamentally different from us. As a result, what we often see, particularly in our culture with racism, is scapegoating. This is the act of blaming an out-group when the in-group experiences frustration or is blocked from obtaining a goal. So for example, even if you look historically in our country over the last several years, decades rather, a shift happened in our culture in terms of where the economy was going to come from and be strongest. The jobs driving the economy became jobs that required intellectual effort versus physical effort. So our industry used to be based on physical labor. And once that shift happened and we went towards intellectual labor, many people who came from parts of the country or familiar cultures that did not prize education and instead focused on physical labor were left in positions where they were not financially secure any longer. Instead of acknowledging that they hadn't changed with the times, instead what they did is blamed people who were different from them as taking resources away from them that they felt they deserved. Of course, that is a reference to entitlement that often is a feeling that people have when they are engaging in scapegoating. Again, blaming others who are not within their group for the discomfort that they are experiencing instead of actually acknowledging the true source of that discomfort. We'll look now at aggression, which is a fitting transition because these types of thoughts and behaviors do and tend to lead to aggressive action. So aggression is seeking to cause harm or pain to another person. And what I think is really important to understand is that aggression, hostility, violence, these things are not limited to physical action. We can be aggressive, hostile, violent in our thoughts, in our feelings, in our behaviors, in our words, our tone, our actions. It's not just physical violence. So hostile aggression is aggression motivated by feelings of anger with the intent to cause pain. Instrumental aggression is aggression motivated by achieving a goal and does not necessarily involve intent to cause pain. Frustration aggression theory is that when humans are prevented from achieving an important goal, they become frustrated and aggressive. Bullying is when a person, often an adolescent, is being treated negatively repeatedly and over time. This can happen with adults as well, of course, but we focus largely in our culture on bully culture for adolescents because that's where we have seen such a rise in disturbing behaviors over the last several years. So who is at greater risk? Children who are emotionally reactive, children who are different from others, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender teens. Cyberbullying is repeated behavior that is intended to cause psychological or emotional harm to another person, and that takes place online. The bystander effect is something that was actually developed. The term itself was developed after a horrific event that happened years ago in New York. And social psychologists' interest in trying to understand how the crime was able to occur in the way that it did. So you can, on your own time, look up Kitty Genovese and see what that story is. The bystander effect refers to a situation in which a witness or a bystander does not volunteer to help a victim or a person in distress. And what we found overwhelmingly through research is that this bystander effect occurs because of diffusion of responsibility. This is a tendency for no one in a group to help because the responsibility to help is spread throughout the group. What this means is that, if you think again, what we've already discussed about conformity, normative behaviors. If you are alone and someone is in need of help, you are likely to take action and help that person. If you are in a group, however, you are likely to wait and look around to see what the other group members think about what's happening, and then you are likely to wait and look around at the other members to see if someone else is going to take action. When no one else takes action, this typically creates a longer pause for everyone in the group because they are trying to assess and figure out what is happening and what is going to happen versus taking action and actually providing help. We'll move now to prosocial behavior. So it's not all bad. Prosocial behavior is voluntary behavior with the intent to help other people. Altruism is a human's desire to help others, even if the costs outweigh the benefits of helping. And empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective, to feel what he or she feels. Research shows that we are overwhelmingly hardwired for all of these things, but we have collectively created situations that make it much harder to unearth these arguably natural parts of being human. So we'll look now at forming relationships. They talk a little bit about relationships and intimacy in this chapter as well. Homophily is the tendency for people to form social networks, including friendships, marriage, business relationships, and many other types of relationships with others who are similar. It's kind of like creating extended little family groups. Reciprocity is a give and take in relationships, and self-disclosure is sharing personal information in relationships. When we have these things in place, we are creating connections, we are giving and taking, we are sharing personal information. These things create intimacy. Intimacy creates the formation of relationships. We'll look at attraction. For females, physically, large eyes, high cheekbones, a narrow jawline, a slender build, and a lower waist to hip ratio are associated with being attractive to men. This is based on research that they've done. Socially, being warm, affectionate, and having strong interpersonal skills or social skills are also seen as attractive. For males, physically being tall, having broad shoulders and a narrow waist. Socially achieving, having leadership qualities, and good job skills. These things are seen based on research as making males attractive. For both, high levels of facial and body symmetry. And that's really interesting. That research actually came out decades ago, but what they found is that overwhelmingly across cultures, that what is considered to be attractive in a face is facial symmetry. So the more symmetrical a face was, the more attractive people were to be rated. Look now at Sternberg's triangular theory of love. So once we get past what is attracting, which is a part of our connection with each other, then this is the theory, Sternberg's theory of how love kind of evolves. So his theory is a model of love based on three components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And several types of love exist depending on the presence or absence of each of these components. So consummate love is a type of love occurring when intimacy, passion, and commitment are all present. Companionate love is a type of love consisting of intimacy and commitment, but not passion. It's associated with close friendships and family relationships. And then romantic love is a type of love consisting of intimacy and passion, but not commitment. So we've seen the social exchange theory before. The idea here is that we act as naive economists and keeping a tally of the ratio of costs and benefits of forming and maintaining a relationship, with the goal to maximize our benefits and minimize our costs. So all of this chapter, again, is talking about interaction. We're not here alone, we're not isolated, we are engaging and interacting with each other. And this theory is saying that we are kind of, not necessarily intentionally, but subconsciously keeping tally of what the cost of engagement is and what the benefit of engagement is, and that we are going to maintain all of our interactions with each other based on this kind of internal cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so that is the chapter. Lots of interesting ideas, hopefully some things that you'll take and think about personally and apply to situations that you encounter personally or witness with other people.